Welcome to Everyday Torah. My name is Trevor. We are continuing with installment 13 of the Melchizedek series. Gary, last time we talked about Hebrews chapter 7, and I know we should do a tiny recap here before you continue on in that. So, what's the recap from last time?
Well, we've been talking about Melchizedek in the book of Hebrews, and sometimes I'll say Paul says, because as we've talked about, I'm firmly convinced that Paul either wrote the book or had a very strong hand in it in some fashion.
Oh, yeah. I have to do link down below quite a lot with you on that one.
Yeah, that's right. Because,
and rightly so.
I mean, it's just, and we will hopefully have a chance to come back to that subject on a later podcast. But it's pretty, to me, it's pretty clear and almost undeniable that Paul is in the background of this book in a very strong way.
And I concur.
So for that reason, I'll just, for lack of I always like to say the author of Hebrews. I mean, it's almost too many words.
Yeah, it's cumbersome.
Cumbersome. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I'll just use Paul as my, as my code word, if you will, for the author. But now going beyond that, I'll give you the recap, because I think we do want to recap because we're kind of building on something, and we're going through the book of Hebrews in a somewhat chronological order. It's actually, this argument is really laid out pretty systematically over most of the book of Hebrews. So we talked about three things last time, and the bullet points would be these: that only the Messiah, as the Son of God, was capable of serving this position of the high priest of Melchizedek. That's where the book of Hebrews actually begins. Mm-hmm. And in fact, the first essentially 4 chapters of this book deals mostly with that subject, and there's a few other things sprinkled in there, but this is the flow, the basic concept that the author is trying to get across, is that very concept. And so we see how he talks about the superiority and the greatness of the Messiah, Yeshua, over the angels, over the principalities and powers. And that further, that these things were necessary. I like to think of the first 4 chapters as in a way of kind of laying out a job description. What are the qualifications for this job, and how does Yeshua fit them? Think of it as a job interview, and you've got a candidate, Yeshua, coming in to say, well, laying claim to being able to accomplish this task. I mean, I think you can think of it that way, and then start to look at these earlier chapters of Hebrews in that light. And this is what the author's doing. He's setting the table for us, showing that he really is the only individual who's ever lived who can fit the bill.
You might not be able to do this off the top of your head, but when you get to Hebrews 4, you have the famous rest text.
Yes.
Yeshua is our rest. And so it seems you're grouping chapter 4 in with that
yes, I am,
qualification statement. So what I'll get is when I'm teaching about Sabbath or talking about Sabbath in seminary class, of course, students will tend to point to that scripture with regard to the Sabbath, that because Yeshua is my Sabbath rest, I no longer have to observe it. And so I block that one out totally. Okay. All right. No, that's not a right understanding of that text.
He's now actually able to make us really rest in that. That's
really, and that might have been our clue.
Yeah.
So is that what you mean by grouping Hebrews 4 in with the qualifications of the Messiah?
Yes, it is. I would grant you that that particular subject is kind of directed more to his audience. Saying, okay, guys, let's look back at the story here. And draw from that story for your benefit. But when you set it in the greater context of the first earlier chapters, you see, yes, there is this other message that's there as well, which is Yeshua makes us able to really press into these things in the true intent and spirit that God always intended for us.
That's, now that, because I know the end of the book of Hebrews, to think that is what is happening to get us to rest in our Messiah in that way.
That's right. That way, yeah.
Yeah, it takes us.
Because remember, think about this. I mean, the Sabbath was created, we know, because we're told this specifically in Genesis 2, and then he creates Eden. Isn't that interesting? It follows immediately after that. And then we have a setting where God is communing with Adam and Eve in Eden.
Good point.
This is what the Sabbath is all about, you see. So God created this for the benefit of Adam and Eve, even before sin entered the world. This, I think, is a very significant idea that needs to be thought through more carefully, because I think that if one sits back and tries to get a bigger picture of this, these ideas that people come up with that somehow, you don't need the Sabbath because we can just rest in Messiah. Well, God says, no, you still need it because you're a human being, and human beings need allocated time for doing certain things. And as you look at the progress of what happens throughout the entire biblical narrative from this point on, we discover that time and special times are extremely important to God. He wants to meet with us. He wants communion with us always. And yet there are times in which he wants special commitment of communion. That seems to be the pattern that's illustrated.
The deer in the headlights. Look, I had this young man come and he wanted to do a Bible study and some stuff that I'm doing, and I wanted to check his theology a little bit, and then we went over this whole appointed time Sabbath thing, and he went through the whole rigmarole on every day is a Sabbath rest for me, and I'm like, oh yeah, so your wedding anniversary is no different than any other day.
Yeah,
and
right.
he just
Exactly.
the whole. I'm like, well, it is special, isn't it? He's like, well, you make a good point there.
There's really a funny thing in the human being, and I know we'll have to get going soon, but I'll just say this, that human beings are funny. And I don't know if this is some great spiritual of the universe, principle or something, but monotony is a bad thing. We don't like monotony. And so when you say everything's the same, you've set up a monotonous situation.
Yeah.
Psychologically. We need special times. We need something to break the monotony. And I've discovered that there are a lot of people, I think a lot of psychological problems in the human condition are due to this. A lot of people talk today about how devastating psychologically boredom has been to people. So many people are bored.
Yeah.
They're bored with life. Yeah. And it's actually creating a psychological condition in people that is not healthy. So I think God knows this. And this is why, if we follow his wisdom, we should be interested in the fact that he set aside time, a special time.
Well, I just want to argue that it is the idea of Hebrews 4 and Yeshua being our Sabbath rest is important to the conversation that without that dynamic of our high priest putting the Holy Spirit into us and us to truly shalom, by observing that day. And I'll just tell you, I got a little goosebumpy when you went through you just talked a little bit about the Sabbath being given and then the Garden of Eden. This is very important to, I think, our understanding of Melchizedek.
Yes,
anyway, I don't think that was a rabbit trail at all.
No.
Yeah, of
good.
Course.
I'm glad we talked about it.
Thank you.
So the following two bullet points, I'll just briefly state. The one that follows this then is that the Messiah had to be perfected. And we talked a little bit about that for this job. And the confusion that's brought by that is people think, when they think perfected, they think there's something wrong with Messiah. He was deficient in some way. And that's not the sense of this at all. Messiah was not deficient. He was perfectly capable, but there was something about the experience that he went through living as a man that somehow equips him in an even greater way to accomplish the objective that God has laid out for him, the Father. And that's really the sense of that term, of perfection. In fact, the term perfect really could be easily translated completed. There's almost like a capstone put on the Messiah because of his experience.
Yeah.
And so this is discussed actually quite a bit in Hebrews chapter 2, and that's what we did. We went to Hebrews 2 and discussed at some length that topic. So, and then the third thing that we discussed was that the priesthood of Melchizedek actually preceded the Levitical priesthood and is superior to it. And we talked, and then this one's really interesting because it gets into a form of argument, by the way, which I believe really does point strongly to Paul, because Paul's the only person that really argues like this in the rest of the New Testament, where we went to Galatians and kind of did a summation of this thing in Galatians, but we did talk about several matters in Hebrews chapter 7 as well, just the earlier part of chapter 7. And we see that what Paul was trying to do, if it was Paul, that showing that there's a sort of a principle that is work here, a precedence is superior to, or we could even say in some ways it also implies, I think, sort of more foundational. And what I mean is if something comes earlier in the text, and particularly if it's rooted in a promise of God, okay, what comes later cannot undo what comes earlier. So there's a natural precedence in the promises of God, certainly. And of course, Melchizedek is all about the promises of God. So when we're talking about this subject, we have to understand then that because Melchizedek comes early in Genesis, I mean, he's introduced to us as a person, and there's obviously something interesting taking place, because Hebrews 7 draws on this, right? This encounter that Abraham has with Melchizedek, it has symbolism. It's a foreshadowing. It's archetypical, if you will, of many important things that are going to come later. And there's one thing that happens that the author stresses, very important, that really points to its precedence to the Levitical priesthood, and it's that Abraham gave tithes to this individual. Now, we've talked about that in some detail in earlier podcasts, but the author here is going back to that and said, guys, this was significant, what happened here. See, This is significant because Abraham recognized the superiority, if you will, quote unquote, the superiority of this man, even over him.
Yeah, I can think of all those listeners thinking Abraham is our father, and that was a line they used, right? And then this author is saying, "Hey, look at what's happening here."
That's exactly right. And so we see this precedence clearly established, and then of course we get introduced to the superiority aspect. In fact, it's kind of implicit here at this point in the argument that there's a superiority, because we know that, well, the Levites, the author tells us, paid tithes to this individual as well. You see? Yeah. So we get the introduction to that superiority here, but we're going to see it more fully developed as we go on in chapters 8, 9, and 10. So that's kind of where we ended last time. And let's see if there's anything I need. Nope, that's pretty much it. So we'll go ahead now and go to the fourth point. And we're still in Hebrews chapter 7. We're going to proceed from this point forward and talk about the issue of the second covenant, or the new covenant, or some people like to refer to it as the renewed covenant. I think you can make a case for that, renewed covenant, because it bears so much similarity actually to the former covenant. But we want to look at the issue of the covenant and this high priest. And what is going on now in this sort of new order of priesthood. Mm-hmm. And so we can summarize it this way, that the Messiah is going to be replacing the Levitical high priest. And unlike a Levitical high priest, his priesthood is forever. It's one that's forever. So, and I might even add, it's also described as a more excellent priesthood. So I'll add that in as well. It's both forever and it's more excellent.
Yeah, and then we have the better covenant. It's a better covenant language.
Yes, that's correct. Yes, all that language is coming into now. And I'm going to talk a little bit later about the more excellent. And I want to stress, even at this point, more excellent is important. In other words, that expression, more excellent, and it's used by Paul in several of his writings, this concept, this idea. I think in Corinthians, he uses the term glorious, more glorious. You see,
yeah.
See, in other words, so that's a different contrast than saying, well, you had this old Levitical thing that was just okay. It was just a custodial kind of thing.
Mediocre,
God did. The mediocre. Yeah.
Yeah.
And now we have the thing that's the true thing,
Right.
That's not the way the author is talking about this. And I think that's important to understand. The other was fine, but this is even better. Yeah. See, this is what, and he's going to give the reasons why it's better. And when you see it that way, it actually gives and puts, I think, the Levitical system into a much more appropriate context. So we'll start with Hebrews 7, and I'll read, of course, 12 to 14. I think we may have read this before, but I should reread it here because of our discussion. It says, for the priesthood being changed, of necessity, there's also a change of the law. For he of whom these things are spoken belongs to another tribe. The he in this case is Yeshua himself, from which no man has officiated at the altar. For it is evident that the Lord arose from Judah, of which tribe Moses spoke nothing concerning priesthood. And yet, far more evident, in the likeness of Melchizedek, there arises another priest who has come, not according to the law of the fleshly commandment, but according to the power of an endless life. For he testifies, you are a priest forever, according to the order of Melchizedek. And so we'll stop there. And so this is a nice way now to begin our discussion of, okay, so we know that Yeshua, what this passage essentially tells us very forthrightly is that he cannot be a Levitical high priest. He can't even be a Levitical priest. He's of the wrong tribe. In other words, his physical inheritance does not match the job qualification for being a Levitical priest or high priest.
Got it.
Now, what is fascinating about this, I think, and I don't think believers spend enough time really pondering this, and it's important, is that the author here feels it is very important that the discussion not only clarify this point that we're talking about, but emphasizes the importance that everything done is according to the law. That the law is important. God is not going to go against his law. He is not going to go against his promises that he's made previously in order to accomplish what he's accomplishing here. The author feels this is an extremely important point that should not be ignored. And so as we go on, we should file that in the back of our minds, as something to not lose sight of. We have to understand that, see, God will maintain his personal integrity with us. Yeah. That's important. I mean, that is, if you start thinking about, well, what if God did not have integrity? We'd all be in a heap of trouble, wouldn't we?
Sure. Yeah.
That would mean, he's promised you eternal life, and he could just on a whim one day decide, well, I think I'll rescind that promise.
Yeah, let's not do that.
I mean, this is how we're taught. You see, God relates to us in a way that even we can understand, because we would have relationships with our fellow human beings, right? And where we would expect the same thing. If somebody made a sacred oath or promise to us, well, by golly, we'd expect them to keep it, right?
Right. And so, if they didn't, trust would be broken.
That's correct.
Know on any future things. Sure.
That's right. And the person who broke it would be, in a sense, liable. And so the author here is telling us, that still holds even in our relationship with God. He's I don't know if it's even appropriate that he comes down to our level, because no, we're really rising to his level in these things. His integrity is unquestionable. It's unmovable. And so these are the things that I think are important for us to keep in mind, because this idea actually influences a lot of things in the scripture. It's and our obedience is one of them. God has given us commands. The promises he's given, some are unconditional, others are conditional. And we find that obedience to him, being obedient servants, is an important part of that relationship. So all of this comes now into the mix, you see, of what we're talking about. And I think it influences our concept and our understanding of priesthood ultimately. So that's why I think it's good to start with this verse so that we can understand it. The other aspect of this verse that's important for us to recognize is here we're introduced to the idea that one priesthood, the Levitical priesthood, was inherited. There was no merit involved. If you were of the right tribe, then you had access to being a priest. I suppose you could decline the job if you wanted to. And I don't know if very many people did that in antiquity, but I suppose in principle, one could say, well, thank you very much, God, but I'm not interested in that job. However, you certainly qualified and could enter the priesthood if you desired, just strictly because of your racial, ethnic, tribal, in this case, inheritance. Your background is appropriate. But the Melchizedek priesthood, as we're going to start to see here, and we're going to see more and more comments talking about this, is a merited priesthood. It's not based on inheritance. It's based on merit. And so what that means, whoever is going to fill the high priest of Melchizedek has to earn it. They have to earn it. And it's the only way you get there.
I hadn't thought about that. I totally see it, though.
And in some ways, if the high priest has to earn his position, what does that mean for us? You see, we're priests serving under a high priest. Does that mean we have to earn that place?
Yeah, that's a good question.
And here, I'm not talking about earning salvation. See, this is the distinction we have to make. No, I'm not talking about earning salvation. That's a different issue. And we can go to Romans and other places to learn more about that. What I'm talking about is earning our place of service as a priest. In other words, are we a priest when we don't behave and do the things of a priest? You see, this is what we're talking about. And the answer, I believe, is no, we're not.
Yeah, it's true. We kind of wantonly throw out that idea of a priesthood of believers.
Yes.
Without really thinking through the implications for some of that stuff.
Yes, that's correct. That's exactly right. And I think that's why I think this discussion we've had over now coming into 13 podcasts is so important for the believing community. I hope it will force conversations that we've been needing to have for a very long time. I mean, what we've been dealing with throughout this series are actually some very fundamental questions. And I fear that a lot of these fundamental questions have not occurred to most people. That's shocking when you think about it. That's a shocking situation, and it's time you start thinking about it because, friends, the world is going in a very dark direction.
Let me tell you why this applies immediately to me is I have a lot of folks running through my seminary classes, and they have questions about, who can we put in leadership? And they're putting a lot of people in leadership that shouldn't be in leadership.
That's exactly right.
And their argument is, well, we're all broken. We're all sinners. And that might be true. But this is the idea of functioning in the role of priest is qualitatively different.
Yes.
So, I think you bring up a good point here. And I see for everyone, the foundational aspect of how we understand ourselves as priests in the order of Melchizedek, that there is something qualitative about our lives that is important as we fill those roles.
That's correct. That's exactly right. Well said, too. I like how you put that. So we'll continue then in Hebrews 7:22 to 28.
Okay.
Kind of moving along here. So in 22, and we're kind of breaking into a thought here, but we'll be able to do that without much hiccup. So by so much more, Jesus, Yeshua, has become a surety of a better covenant. But because he continues forever, so now we're going to get into this forever aspect. has an unchangeable priesthood. Therefore, he is able to save to the uttermost those who come to God through him, since he always lives to make intercession for them. For such a high priest was fitting for us, one who is holy, harmless, undefiled, separate from sinners, and has become higher than the heavens, who does not need daily, as those other high priests, to offer up sacrifices, first for his own sins and then for the people's. For this he did once for all when he offered up himself. For the law appoints as high priests men who have weakness, but the word of the oath, which came after the law, appoints a son who has been perfected forever. So this verse actually now, as you notice, is drawing a little bit on previous material, the thing that the authors addressed earlier that we talked somewhat about last week, and now kind of putting it together. And so this is kind of a little bit of a place where I'm almost feeling in his argument, he's kind of doing a little bit of an initial summarization in order to sort of consolidate, ideas in his argument.
Okay.
And we're learning that he is the surety of a better covenant. Why a better covenant? Why is this better? Well, the passage tells us because it's unchangeable. It's able to provide for continual intercession on the behalf of the beneficiaries. That would be us, because this high priest is eternal. Pardon me. This high priest is eternal and is undefiled, separate from sinners. In other words, he is categorically different than us in that he didn't sin. So he's separate from the sinners. He's not beset with the problem of sin. And if you think about it, the high Levitical priesthood, we're told, well, they weren't separate from sin. They had to actually offer for themselves first and then offer the sacrifice.
Right.
So this already, you see how we're building up to the better priesthood, the better promises, because the reason it's better, we might think it lets us off the hook of doing certain things. That makes it better, right? No, it's better because of who is now the high priest. Everything that makes this covenant better is directly tied into the quality of the individual who serves in this position. This is what Hebrews is going to tell us.
Yeah.
The word of the oath we're told about is, I think, a reference back to Psalm 110:4. The thing that I want to emphasize here is that this is a little tricky part of his argument. And that's why I'm just going to spend a few moments on it, because we think about it this way. We think, well, wait a minute, didn't the oath come after the Levitical priesthood? If it's in Psalm 110, it's the time of David. This was hundreds and hundreds of years after Abraham, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so how do we come to understand that? And here, I believe what Paul is attempting to do is we see, in essence, that though the statement of the oath to David, I think wrote that psalm, comes quite a bit following the institution of the Levitical priesthood, the author earlier in the chapter has drawn out a very important aspect of Abraham's relationship to Melchizedek. And by drawing the inference that, in fact, the Levitical priesthood, in a sense, was kind of birthed out of this relationship Abraham had with Melchizedek. The Melchizedek priesthood actually preceded it. And what was being put forth in an oath is now that the Melchizedek priesthood was going to be transferred to David's line.
Yeah.
Is the beginning. Do you see that?
Totally see it, yeah.
So it's kind of like it's a little bit of something that's it's a nuanced kind of thing. We always expect this, perfect order of things. and it's there, but at first glance you could be a little bit confused because, well, he says established on the oath, but the oath came after, and Levitical was first, and so there's a potential source of confusion there. And
Sure.
And this is this type of thing that I've encountered this before in the scripture, where you get in your own mind a certain order worked out, and then there's this little clinker that's thrown in. You go, oh, wait a minute, what am I going to do with that? And then as you explore it, you realize, well, no, on a second look, there was really a precedence for this that occurred earlier, but you have to kind of go after it. And so I bring this forward to all of your viewers, that this is the way the Bible is written. It's not a textbook, it's a narrative. And at times it has all of these levels and nuances to it that can sometimes change the picture a little bit if you know that information's out there. Right. And you're not going to read the Bible linearly. Right. You have to always read it with an idea of the full revelation in the background, and how that could influence how you understand and interpret certain things. So I think this is a good passage for that point, that this is one of those places where, and the author, by doing this, by the way, is really telling us another thing, is that his audience, who he was writing to, there must have been a lot of sophisticated people there in the Word. Mm-hmm. They would have had to, if this would have meant something to them, would have illuminated them, then these were not people who were, very marginally familiar with the scriptures. No, these were people that knew. They knew well enough that they could track what the author was telling them. Yeah. So this better covenant, then, just to mention this a little further, I would say it maybe this way. If we think about the man Yeshua, I mentioned earlier that the man Yeshua is the reason that this is a better covenant. And if we just ponder for a moment what Yeshua accomplished, what he accomplished in his sinless life, and we talked a little bit about that last time, and what he accomplished in his full submission to the Father in his death, and what he's accomplishing even now then as high priest in the heavens, as we've been told, making intercession for us. Well, this is a slam dunk, isn't it? It's obviously, we're talking about a superior priesthood. Yeah. Yeah. You see, and it's all based upon the man Yeshua, who is now not just a mere man, but is God himself in the heavens with the Father at the right hand of the Father, making continual intercession for all of us. Yeah, just theologically, I think everyone in the evangelical community understands it's all about Yeshua. We get that part. Mm-hmm. I don't think the part that we get is why it's all about him. Yes, that's exactly right. That's right. We sort of know, we understand sort of the statement, but we don't know what underlies that statement. Right. And it provides further insight as well to show why maybe human history had to be worked out the way that it was. It gives more insight as maybe this wasn't completely accidental, how things unfolded, in a sort of historical temporal sense. And as we're going to see later, the ordering of this does not threaten the plan. And I think that's also this is really a deep thing, and it almost amazes me that an ancient writer could even think like this. Really, honestly, when we begin to explore how his divine nature fits into this picture. Mm-hmm. So we're going to go on with that now and go into chapter 8. Okay. We leave chapter 7, we go to chapter 8. I know I'm skipping a few passages here and there, but because of our time, I just want to hit the most central points as we go along and make, I hope, will be a coherent argument for your audience. So let's look at the first 6 verses of chapter 8, because this is now going to give us an additional insight that I think is very important. Now this is the main point of the things we are saying. We're at verse 1. We have such a high priest who is seated at the right hand of the throne of the majesty in the heavens, a minister of the sanctuary and of the true tabernacle which the Lord erected, and not man. For every high priest is appointed to offer both gifts and sacrifices. Therefore, it is necessary that this one, that is Yeshua, also have something to offer. For if he were on earth, this is a very interesting verse. For if he were on earth, he would not be a priest at all, since there are priests who offer the gifts according to the law, who serve the copy and shadow of the heavenly things, as Moses was divinely instructed when he was about to make the tabernacle. For he, God said, see that you make all things according to the pattern shown you on the mountain. But now, Yeshua, he, sometimes I'll just stick in the name because it can be a little bit confusing with all the pronouns. But now Yeshua has obtained a more excellent ministry, inasmuch as he is also the mediator of a better covenant, which was established on better promises.
Yeah.
Okay. So that term better, and we're going to come back in a moment and talk a little bit about that more excellent ministry. I think that's very significant in this passage. So one of the things that we learn then is that Yeshua is, and this is where the argument really starts to begin to transition to the comparison of the earthly and heavenly sanctuary. And so I'll just mention that it kind of begins here in this verse, and you can see he's at the right hand of the Father. He's in the true tabernacle that's in the heavens, and he's functioning there for us.
Right.
In fact, what Moses was making was a physical tabernacle that was patterned after that true tabernacle in the heavens, as he puts it. So it's not Yeshua copying the Levites; it's Levites copying Melchizedek.
Yeah, that's an important point. Yeah,
that's right.
It's not that we don't know that; it's just that we don't really think about how important that is to the biblical narrative.
That's exactly right. That's it. That's what we're doing here. We're hopefully helping people to connect a few dots that, for whatever reason they're not thinking about, but draw their attention to them, because you're right. Anybody can connect these dots. This is not hard. Once you're kind of alerted to it, you realize, oh yeah, I guess I do really need to think this through a little bit more and draw the connections that the author is asking me to draw. And
even then there are other parts, like for example, I'm thinking about Yeshua with Pilate, and Pilate saying, hey, is your kingdom of this world and such? And Yeshua is like, no. So there's some other dialogue that there's a little bit more depth to what undergirds some of those words.
Yes.
Yeshua is saying that you might not pick up on those nuances unless you understand that he understands he's in the order of Melchizedek and that his kingdom is not of this world.
Yes, that's exactly right. That's exactly right. Yeah, and isn't it a great illustration that here we can talk about an incident that I think a lot of people are familiar with. I would certainly hope so. Mm-hmm. And yet, have they ever thought about it from that perspective before?
Yeah.
And would they, were it not for our kind of discussion?
Right,
yeah. So we see that the statement, and I find this a curious one, for if he were on earth, he would not be a priest. What's all that about?
Yeah, let's explain this. Yeah. What does that mean?
And this is another one that is one of those kind of nuanced things, I think. Mm-hmm. The real implication, I think, is twofold. First, that Yeshua's priestly ministry was really not required in the earthly sanctuary, since there were actually already priests serving to make offerings there.
Okay.
And so that's kind of the level of it where you can say, oh, okay, I could see that, It's actually stated in the paragraph here. But there's another nuance to this that maybe require a little more elaboration. And I believe it's this, and this I have to get from kind of putting a few things together, including some things that are going to come subsequently. But it's something to the following, that it's clear that Yeshua came to ultimately replace the Levitical high priest, didn't he? Yeah, that seems to be clear. And we base that, by the way, also on the Old Testament. The Old Testament strongly intimates this through the visions of Ezekiel, especially in Ezekiel's temple. that this is going to be a replacement question we're talking about. In other words, you're not going to have two high priests serving side by side, one doing one thing, one doing another thing. This is a complete replacement. So we have that. And I've come to the conclusion that as long as the Levitical high priest existed and functioned in his priestly duties, Yeshua was not being allowed to replace him on the earth. Okay. And that is, I think, also contained a little bit in this statement, that he could not replace him because there were promises made, and God did not want the dissolution of the Levitical high priesthood to necessarily be connected with Yeshua, in a sense, supplanting him.
Yeah.
This is my belief.
I can see that. Yeah.
Because when you think about it, even as the author is writing now, and the author probably wrote this book either, very close to, during, or immediately after the fall of the temple. If it was after the fall of the temple, then Paul would not have written it, though he could have been a strong influencer of it. But I believe there's some evidence to indicate the temple was still around during the writing of this. So we might be looking at the mid to latter part of the 60s AD or something like that when this. So when Paul's writing this, then if it wasn't Paul, that he's talking to a community where he would know that perhaps in a very short time the system was going to go away. He's making this up, and yet here we have Yeshua in the heavens, serving the high priestly role today for us. And you begin to sense in the text as you're going along that, that's going to probably remain the case until he comes back to earth, right? So it's going to be his second coming when that's going to end. He's not going to, because if he was going to be on the earth, well, then he'd come back to the earth. And so that in itself, then you sort of wonder, like, for the community at this time, you would like to know, what was the author thinking here? Did he think that could happen in a very short time as well? That the high priest of the heavens would bring his heavenly sanctuary, as it were, down to earth? Yeah. Or, what was that all about? And all you can say is, well, it's kind of left open at this point when he would return. But what seems clear is he would have to return then to reestablish a priesthood in which he was high priest on the earth.
Well, and I could see too that, imagine if this book hadn't been written, and then the destruction of the temple.
Yes.
I mean, there's a sense in which I know that the early Yeshua followers would have continued on in the feasts and understood that the telos, the culmination, was to be found in Messiah Yeshua. And they're doing these things, but there's a very real thing of, oh my gosh, in a sense, Kiev, to use that illustration, is gone.
Yes.
Now what?
Yeah.
But the thing is, the heavenly priesthood, even though we do not have this temple, the tabernacle, it's still fully functional, doing what it's supposed to be doing.
Yes, that's correct. That's exactly right. And it is interesting in some ways that there may even be a little bit of a, working into God's plan. And now we're getting a little bit deep, but you look at the chronology. Okay, so what's clear is the Levitical priesthood did not disappear when Yeshua was crucified. Right. And when you think about it, it could have, right? Isn't it interesting that Matthew's account, what do we learn? Well, at this time, the curtain in the temple is rent, right? Yeah. Indicating apparently that somehow the access to the Holy of Holies maybe had changed. That's what some people interpret from that event. and you ask yourself, well, gee, wouldn't that have been a perfect time to just rend the whole temple? Why didn't God do that? Sure. I mean, it's almost like Matthew is setting the table, but even Matthew recognizes, because, he lived on decades after this event, he realized that it didn't happen. God didn't remove the priesthood like this. And so there must be something more to why he did not do that. We have this 40-year overlap as it were,
Right.
after the crucifixion to the destruction of the temple. And maybe through that, what God was emphasizing was that this priesthood of this new era of, if you will, new era, new age of the church was going to function in a different way, in a different manner, because it had to. In order to accomplish God's purposes, the priesthood really could not be on the earth. It had that sense to it. And I believe that's kind of what's going on here is that. And so when we look at this, we have to kind of see that what there is in this passage is an intimation by the Lord that of a change. And then what's going to happen is when Yeshua comes back to the earth, he will be a priest functioning on the earth because he will be bringing the heavenly sanctuary with him down to the earth, and he will be that high priest. So, in other words, the job will not change, only his particular location will change.
Yeah.
That idea, that idea. So that's at least how I've attempted to reconstruct it, that concept. So you can see this is where the deep stuff sometimes comes in, is trying to now relate it to the things we've already learned. And keep in mind, I know that the author, whoever it was, of Hebrews, knew the Old Testament very well, knew very well about Ezekiel's temple and all of these things, even though there's no direct reference to Ezekiel's temple in Hebrews, but it's clearly in the background. It really forms the backdrop to a number of things that the author here is going to discuss.
Yeah.
So we'll go on then to Hebrews 8, 7 to 13. We'll just kind of continue the thought. It says, for if that first covenant had been faultless, then no place would have been sought for a second. Because finding fault with them, he says, behold, the days are coming, says the Lord, that I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and the house of Judah. Not according to the covenant I made with their fathers in the day when I took them by the hand to lead them out of the land of Egypt, because they did not continue in my covenant, and I disregarded them, says the Lord. For this is the covenant that I will make with the house of Israel after those days. I will put my laws into their mind and write them on their hearts. And I will be their God, and they shall be my people. None of them shall teach his neighbor, saying, know the Lord, for all shall know me. And we've talked about this before. That knowing there is an intimate knowledge of God. All will have that intimate knowledge of God.
Yeah.
Why? Because the law has been written on their hearts. From the least of them to the greatest of them, for I will be merciful to their unrighteousness, and to their sins and lawless deeds I will remember no more. In that he says, a new covenant, he has made the first obsolete. Now what is becoming obsolete and growing old is ready to vanish away. Okay. So I'll move pretty rapidly through this next part. Okay. So I up the pace a little bit. There is a number of familiar things here, but there's a couple of things we want to make clear before we leave this. Because there are things in this passage that first could seem troubling to some, but when it's properly laid out, we can really appreciate what the author is telling us here. The first thing to notice is the use of the plural pronoun them in verse 8. Let me go back to that for just a moment. First covenant had been faultless, then no place would have been sought for a second, because finding fault with them.
Mm-hmm.
The them are the people of Israel. What this statement is saying is very profound, particularly to people that have been indoctrinated in other ways of interpretation. It's saying, in effect, that, guys, the reason for the failure of the first covenant had nothing to do with the covenant, had nothing to do with God.
You're right.
There's only one culpable party.
Yep.
It's the Israelites. That's the reason it failed. So if you're looking for, well, there was something wrong with the law. Not in this passage. That's not the problem. In fact, we see that that's part of the solution. later in the passage, what does he say? I will take the law, and it no longer will be on tablets of stone. It's going to be in their minds and their hearts.
Amen.
You see? So in the Hebrew concept of a covenant, we should know this, but I think because we're a society that really doesn't make covenants anymore, certainly not on a regular basis, right? It's a rare thing. In fact, we don't even make covenants when we get married anymore.
Right?
That was considered really, I mean, if anybody made a covenant in their life, right? It was that one, and that was not that long ago. In my parents' generation, people were still doing that. Not today.
Yeah, it's
there
sad,
are
but
no,
true, Gary.
yeah,
No.
I know. And what has happened is the modern American has no clue of what a covenant even is. A covenant is a sacred thing. It's very sacred between the parties, and it involves two parties, and it involves some terms and conditions between the parties that bind them into relationship. So you could think of it as three components to a covenant. And in that covenant, the author is telling us, well, God's not responsible for the failure. And as we're going to see, as we read the whole passage, his terms and conditions aren't responsible.
Right?
There's only one party that's responsible here. That's what he's telling us here. It was the hearts of the people. And it appears that God knew that going in. He knew the hearts were corrupted. So he entered this covenant for the express purpose of demonstrating both to the Israelites and to all of humanity that, guys, the problem is with you. See, that's the point of the Old Testament. Guys, the problem is with humanity. It's with I think if you the heart of man.
And you know why Paul says it was a ministry of death.
Yes.
I think sometimes we read that in Corinthians, we're like, what does that mean?
That's right.
Ministry of death.
That's right.
Why was that even a ministry? It's a ministry to point out the obvious.
Yes.
You guys are messed up.
That's right. That's exactly right. That's right. That's exactly the point of it. God knew full well there was a missing ingredient, which in some sense he regards should not needed to have been there, but it does need to be there.
Yeah.
And so that ingredient and what it involves, according to the author of Hebrews, as we walk further into the narrative here, is it needed the right person to officiate as high priest.
Amen.
It couldn't be just a mortal human being. That was the problem. And this is what Israel still needs to see to this day. They long for reestablishing the priesthood and the Levitical high priest, right? People talk about it openly in Israel in some quarters, They are still looking to a man to officiate at the altar.
Yeah. Okay.
And God is saying, guys, you kind of missed the point here.
Right.
That's not what you need. You need something much greater than a man officiating at the altar in the heavens on your behalf.
Amen.
See, this is what he's leading to.
Yeah.
And so as we've talked, and here I'll just mention that this passage that we just read, it's a well-known passage. A lot of people are familiar with Jeremiah 31. This is where this was quoted from. But they maybe don't think about the words too carefully. The writing of the law in your heart and your mind. See, it's not that the law has been abandoned. It's not being done away. It's rather being realized in a brand new way within us. That's really what Jeremiah 31 is talking about.
Yeah.
So it's not just about rote letter. It's not just about, dog and pony show, as I like to talk about a lot, right? Where, we're the little doggy and God is saying, okay, doggy, jump through the hoop. And if you do, I'll give you a treat. No, this is not the relationship God is looking for. He's not looking for pets. He's looking for sons and daughters that bear his name and bear his image. That's what he's looking for. And if we get that in our minds, then we can begin to say, yes, okay, now it makes sense what he's doing. It brings coherency to the entire thing. Should mention, by the way, this uncircumcised hearts and the resolving of this problem is the only passage in the New Testament, and is quoted from the Old Testament prophet, that actually gives a full definition of what the new covenant is. It's the only one. Mm-hmm. It's the only place you'll find it. Jesus talks about, drink this cup. It's the new covenant in my blood. He expects his disciples to understand what that means based upon his teaching, the summation of his entire teaching.
Yeah.
And it's summarized here. This was the goal. What was the goal of Yeshua's teaching? To circumcise the hearts of the people so that they would want to come and have a relationship with God and come to know their God. That's what he was doing. Full circle. So say we got it all wrapped up. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I want to go on, and hopefully we'll have.
We got
time.
about 5 minutes here.
Oh, am I that short? Am I that short? Well, okay. I'm going to have trouble.
Or you can just wrap it up now, and then we'll go into the next part next time.
Yeah,
it's up to you.
Yeah. It's. Let's see. Let me do one more section here. Okay, let's see if I can get through that. I know it was good though. I mean, I think we needed to discuss the matters we discussed.
Well, you got about 5 minutes here, and I'll just be totally silent and let you do your thing.
Yeah, this is a good one. I can do this one fairly quickly. It's an important idea because right after this discussion of the circumcised hearts, I'm going to talk about how this is the first quote of Jeremiah 31. There's another quote of Jeremiah 31 that comes in the middle of chapter 10. These are like brackets. And now what you do is you look between the brackets and say, what's discussed between these brackets? And I'm going to make the argument that it is these things, at least that the author here is telling us, were made obsolete with the coming of Yeshua as high priest. These specific things. And we are not to generalize beyond the text. This is really critical for understanding Hebrews. Hebrews is going to tell us, guys, okay, I talked about the first is obsolete. What do I mean by that? What first? What part of the first is obsolete? Because you don't have to make the entire thing obsolete to have a second, do you? You don't. There's no logical reason to do that, you know?
Yeah.
So this is what Paul is going to be doing now in chapter 9. One of the things he will be doing is laying out what has been made obsolete. So chapter 9, verses 1-5, real quickly. Then indeed, even the first covenant, that's in italics, so it wasn't in the original, even the first had ordinances of divine service and the earthly sanctuary. For a tabernacle was prepared, the first in which was the lampstand, the table, and the showbread, which are called the sanctuary. They were actually in the sanctuary, or what we sometimes refer to as just the holy place in the temple. So it's in that sort of bigger chamber that comes just before you step into the Holy of Holies. That's what he's referring to. And then verse 3, and behind the second veil, the part of the temple which is called the holiest all. So we get that. That's where the Ark of the Covenant was, as we're going to learn. This had the golden censer and the Ark of the Covenant overlaid on all sides with gold, in which were the golden pot that had the manna, Aaron's rod that budded, and the tablets of the covenant. Verse 5, and above it were the cherubim of glory overshadowing the mercy seat. So we get this description, and we won't have time to develop this at this moment, but all of these items that were there, they all foreshadow Yeshua. The menorah and the bread are pointing to a common theme that we find in the book of John's gospel, Yeshua as what? The bread of life. The light of the world. Mm-hmm. You know, so it addresses the sort of person of Yeshua. The golden censer, or here, this is an interesting question which I can only touch upon because of our time, but the golden censer I think is the appropriate, seems to be what's intended here in this verse by the Greek word used and by context, as opposed to the ark, incense. The incense altar.
Yeah, the altar of incense.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And we're going to see that, because when you look at it, it says that the censer and the Ark of the Covenant were inside the Holy of Holies, which is actually not true. the altar of incense was just immediately outside. I mean, it was virtually inside, but not quite. It was just outside. And the offering of incense on most of the year, all but one day a year, was on that incense altar. Okay. But the censer is different. The censer is an article that contains incense. You bring the incense with the censer. And on the day of Yom Kippurim, this is going to be a little reference to Yom Kippurim now. It turns out that the high priest, when they went in to offer the incense, did not offer it outside. They had a pan from which they took the coals of the altar that was located out in the inner courtyard. The coals were brought in with the censer, one in each hand, and they came into the Holy of Holies, laid the pan down at the right at the foot of the Ark of the Covenant, and the incense was offered by sprinkling the incense over the hot coals right in the presence of God in the Holy of Holies. And that was done on Yom Kippurim. This, I believe, is what the author is referencing here. Why he puts the description. You notice he kind of ignores the Ark of the incense altar. And he is addressing this golden censer, and I believe it's because in a real sense, on this day of Yom Kippurim, it was as though the Ark of the I keep calling it Ark. I'm sorry, the incense altar. It's like the incense altar was transported one day of the year into the Holy of Holies. It was like functionally that's what was happening.
Right.
See? And so this was the idea, and there's much that we're going to talk about in relationship to this next time, in what follows chapter 9, or this part of chapter 9.
Okay, so our just for our listeners, Yom Kippurim is just Yom Kippur, which is the Day of Atonement, but the im part means plural. So it is Day of Atonement, plural. Mm-hmm. So just so you know what the point of reference.
Correct.
Okay, Gary, last 30 seconds here. Do you want any final wrap up before next time?
Can you give me 2.5 minutes?
Oh gosh. Now for you 2.5 minutes, you know me. Man. So I'm going to give you a minute and we'll see if we can get to 2.5.
All right. So what I want to just show you then is those articles are the things that are missing. Okay. In Ezekiel's temple. Keep that in your mind.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
They're all missing. They're all missing in Ezekiel's temple. So that's the first part. Now we get to the Yom Kippurim. My contention is the entire section from chapter 9, from the beginning and working all the way to that other quote, and even a little beyond that, but essentially to the other quote, the principal, almost exclusive subject of that section of Hebrews is the ritual of Yom Kippuri. There are a number of references to it. Let me give you some. The golden censer brought into the Holy of Holies. We just read that in verse 4 of chapter 9. The sacrifices that are offered once per year in verse 7 of chapter 9. Yom Kippurim. There were special sacrifices, and they are mentioned in the section here. Year by year, every year, chapter 10, verse 1, chapter 10, verse 3, respectively. Those are all referenced to Yom Kippurim. Blood of bulls and goats. The bulls and the goats are the central sacrificial animals for Yom Kippurim, mentioned in chapter 9, verses 12, 13, and 19. So you can begin to see here. Remission. Remission was a part of the process, the central focus of the sacrifices of Yom Kippurim. Chapter 9, verse 22, chapter 10, verse 18. A whole description in verse 25, which we'll read later, chapter 9, about the high priest who enters once per year. And it goes on to describe what the high priest is doing. Enters the holiest place. Chapter 10, verse 19. Do you see the picture here?
Oh, I see it.
Now, I've read to you 11 verses, and there's even a 12th verse here. In 10:25, remember, it says, don't forsake the assembling yourselves together as you see the day. Approaching that day there is Yomah from the, this is found in the Peshitta text, so they understood it, which is Aramaic translation. They understood it as Yomah, which means the day. It doesn't mean just a day. It means the day, and it had a special application in Aramaic to the Day of Atonement or the Day of Yom Kippuri.
So is this the day coming in the future?
Yes, I think it's a future reference. I do.
Okay, yeah.
Because the Yom Kippurim day, what it represents is the day of the cleansing of the people of Israel. That day, you see. So now you put all this together, and what I'm going to argue as we go on to the next couple items here is that if that is true, and if Yom Kippurim is essentially the focus of this section, along with the articles in the furniture, the furniture in the holiest place, and in the holiest of all as well, because we know the ark will not be there as well. These are the things that the author is highlighting that will be absent, that are now obsolete. And isn't it interesting, as I made reference to earlier, that in Ezekiel's temple, these are the very things that Ezekiel omits in his visions. I think Paul, or whoever wrote Hebrews, knew this. They understood this. They understood that, yes, isn't it fascinating? And they're looking retrospectively as well. They're looking back on the last maybe 30, 40 years since the crucifixion of Messiah and realizing, well, if he's serving these functions now, and oh yes, in the day when he returns, guess what's missing? All these articles are missing. The service of Yom Kippurim is not mentioned in Ezekiel's temple. The high priest is not even there to do it, at least not the Levitical high priest. So to me, the absence of these things now takes on a whole new character, because we can see that the vision of Ezekiel's temple is clearly in some manner informing this entire discussion. It's giving us a clue, a very profound clue, as to the entire meaning of what is happening now in Yeshua's jurisdiction as high priest after the order of Melchizedek, as he makes intercession for us continually and forever.
Okay, Gary, with that, cliffhangers are good. Maybe they'll click on podcast number 14.
Yes.
I'm not into clicks and subscribers.
Well, we're almost there. We won't need too much longer on Hebrews, but it's sort of, you get into it and you realize, well, I cannot say this. That's my problem with this whole series. Well, I cannot say this. Well, I cannot say that, and you go along, it just,
totally see that.
You want to sort of fit it in a time, but you hit something and you go, well, how can I move on without at least mentioning this or saying something about this?
Well, yeah. So, and just for everyone watching, listening, Yeshua walked in that Torah, these instruction, these vows, this covenant, we are to walk in as well. And part of, there's a proverb that says, although the writer is saying, because I follow your law, I am wiser than all my other counterparts.
Absolutely.
And you got to understand that as we walk in this stuff, you live it, you breathe it, you look forward to it. These are things that truly do make you wise, because wisdom is the wisdom of the kingdom. When you understand what the kingdom is about, how Yeshua fits into that. This is what we are about, and we're going to do this every day of our lives. That's why we call it Everyday Torah. We'll see you next time.